Thanks for your patience. In typical DC fashion, we're starting just a couple of minutes late as folks trickle in. But thank you so much for joining us here today at the Conflict Resolution and Prevention Forum. For those of you who aren't familiar with this event series, the CPRF has been around since 1999, which is pretty old in DC standards. It's a once-a-month event series focused on areas around conflict and prevention. And we cover all different topics, whether they're country-specific or thematic. The CPRF is led in partnership with a number of universities and academic partners and practitioner partners. And so you can sign up for the emails to see the various events coming up, and we hope to see you at future CPRFs. But as you know, today's event is focused on the new landscape of countering violent extremism in Southeast Asia. Countering violent extremism has, of course, been a fairly predominant conversation here in Washington for the last couple years. And more we've seen kind of an international focus towards the Southeast Asia region, recognizing that this is an area with not only experience dealing with these challenges in the past, but new challenges that are emerging, and some questions coming up about how do we learn from what happened in the past, what are the unique opportunities, but also the unique barriers in this region in particular, and how can we start building resiliencies against violent extremism in the region. So I'm very pleased to have our wonderful panel here today. I should have introduced myself. I'm Kimberly Hart. I'm the Senior Manager for Global Affairs and Partnerships at Search for Common Ground. And today we have with us John Brandon, the Senior Director for International Relations at the Asia Foundation. We have Siniša Vuković, I hope I pronounced that one right, an Assistant Professor here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And then Luke Waggoner, who's a Senior Governance Advisor at the International Republican Institute. So I thought the way we could start off today was kind of focusing on the big questions that were in the invitation that we sent out. How's the landscape changing? What can be learned from some of these longstanding efforts? What are the key risks? And maybe we'll start with John. John has a lot of experience here in Washington. He's the Associate Director of the Asia Foundation's Washington, D.C. office. He managed the foundation's Asian Views on America's Role in Asia for 2016, which examines U.S. and Asian relations in depth and makes recommendations on U.S. policy for the region. He also monitors U.S. policy towards the Asia-Pacific region, and his background is in Southeast Asia. So we've asked John to kind of kick us off with a big picture analysis of the region, and then we'll shift into some more specific country examples as we get a little bit further in the agenda.
Sure. Thank you very much, Kimberly, and thank you all very much for coming this morning. Let me divide my talk into 3 sections in about 10 minutes time or so. I'd like to just briefly explain what the Asia Foundation does for those of you who might not know, to talk about the changing landscape as Kimberly outlined, and then also to illustrate what we do with some of the programs that we are and have been working on in countering violent extremism in Southeast Asia. The Asia Foundation was founded in 1954. We're headquartered in San Francisco, and the only other office in the United States is here in Washington. But the thrust of the Foundation's work is in Asia. We have 18 country field offices that span all 3 subregions of Asia, Northeast, Southeast, and South Asia. But of those 18 offices, 9 of them are in Southeast Asia. They're in Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and also Timor-Leste. We work, broadly speaking, in strengthening governance predicated on civil society building and predicated on rule of law, empowering women, promoting economic opportunity, increasing environmental resilience, and fostering international relations and regional cooperation through programs that strengthen U.S.-Asia relations as well as among Asian nations themselves. Under our governance programs, the Foundation works with partners in government, civil society, and academia to develop stronger mechanisms for managing conflict and reducing violence. I'll speak more about these programs in just a few minutes, but let me take the opportunity to provide a sense of the challenges Southeast Asia is facing in general in countering violent extremism, including the threat of ISIS, and which is somewhat of a new phenomenon to the region. Terrorism and violent extremism is not something new to Southeast Asia. Probably it first really came to Americans' minds was the Bali bombing in October of 2012. And we had Jamaat Islamiyah, that was involved for that bombing, which was an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. But within a few years since ISIS was created back in 2014, it's eclipsed both al-Qaeda and JI as the region's biggest threat. Now, with the Islamic State being driven out of Iraq and Syria, it's beginning to decentralize elsewhere around the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, but also in Southeast Asia, and so most notably in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines. And so from May to October last year, there was conflict between fighters linked with ISIS and the Philippine Armed Forces, which wound up killing 800 jihadists, including ISIS-inspired leaders Isnalon Hapilon and Omar Maute. They were the leaders of the Abu Sayyaf group and the Maute group, who declared their allegiance to ISIS. 163 Philippine soldiers died, and at least 47 civilians died. But that left 200,000 people, virtually the entire population of Marawi, on the island of Mindanao, displaced. We're now 4 or 5 months later after the end of that conflict, and water and electricity remain unavailable, and reconstruction of Marawi is estimated to cost $1 billion. Now, when Marawi was taken over there were about 400 or 500 ISIS-inspired fighters who did that. But most of the 90% of them were from the Philippines, from Mindanao. But there was about 10% of the fighters who came from other countries, most notably Indonesia, followed by Malaysia. But there was a smattering of fighters that also came from Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Chechnya, Yemen, Morocco, Turkey, and India. But despite how disturbing this ISIS-inspired violence is, I think we also have to take this into proper context. Few people realize that there are more Muslims living in Southeast Asia than there are in any other region in the world, the Middle East, Africa, anywhere. Of the 630 million people who live in Southeast Asia, about 250 million are Muslims. That's about 42% of Southeast Asia's regional population, and it's about 25% of the global Muslim population. Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim country, with approximately 205 million people, about 88% of its population. And Malaysia, 62% of its population is Muslim. And then in other countries around the region, in Thailand, the Philippines, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Singapore, the population is much smaller, but it is a distinct minority in those nations. And so while it's difficult to provide an exact number of Southeast Asians who went to Iraq and Syria in 2014, estimates range anywhere from 900 to as high as 1,800. More than 100 Southeast Asians were believed to have died fighting in the Middle East. To accommodate these fighters, ISIS established the Katiba Nusantara, a fighting unit dedicated to the Malay-speaking world of Southeast Asia, under the leadership of a man named Barum Saya. He was an Indonesian who made a recruitment video urging Malay-speaking Southeast Asians to go fight in Syria. He was killed last March in a botched suicide attack. But even when taking that total number, whether it was 1,500 or whatever number you want to give to it based on the estimates I've given, it's believed that 45% of those people were mothers and children of the fighters. So if you had 1,500 people go, you're really talking about people doing the actual fighting, maybe a little over 800. So it's a rather small number when you compare this to how large the population is. And so I didn't want to give the impression of that this is all just sort of like rabid jihadists running all over Southeast Asia. It's a very small number, but it's a small number that could also inspire and wreak havoc as well. And so there is reason to have caution. But there's also other types of subnational conflict in Southeast Asia where ISIS has not been involved. In Thailand, there's been a decades-long separatist movement since 2004 that has festered in Thailand in the 3 southernmost provinces and in some districts in Songkhla province in the Deep South. Over this 14-year period, over 6,100 people have been killed and 10,000 have been wounded. The conflict, in my view, is not so much about religion as it is about ethnicity. Malays, who comprise 80% of the region's 3 million people, are Muslim, and they feel there's no space for them in the three pillars of the Thai nation state. The three pillars are nation, king, and religion. As nation, the great majority of people in Thailand are Thai, and when you're a Thai, you are most likely to be Buddhist. And the king, even though he's the defender of all faiths, he's the leader of the Buddhist faith, and so there's a disconnect in not feeling as part of the state. There's an alienation. In Myanmar, the region's most known story right now is the plight of the Rohingya Muslim minority, who are believed to be being ethnically cleansed, and the most persecuted group on the planet. An insurgent group called the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army was formed in 2013 and is headed by Atta Ullah, an ethnic Rohingya born in Karachi, Pakistan, who grew up in Saudi Arabia. Other leaders from ARSA are emigres from Saudi Arabia. The Myanmar government has labeled ARSA a jihadist terrorist group, while ARSA says it's an ethno-nationalist insurgent group. At this juncture, they're poorly resourced and are unable to take over towns or cities like what happened in Marawi. But beyond that, there are still a lot of fighting in what is the world's longest civil war in Myanmar. Ethnic groups on Myanmar's northern and eastern borders have been fighting against the military since very shortly after Myanmar's independence was gained 70 years ago in 1948. Last month, in response to what happened in Marawi, all members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations have signed an intelligence pact called the Our Eyes Initiative, where senior defense officials have pledged to meet every 2 weeks to swap information on militant groups and develop a common base of violent extremists. Given the high level of distrust ASEAN nations have felt toward each other historically, if this is to happen, this is a significant development. But for this for this initiative to be effective, it's going to have to overcome this historic mistrust. Let me turn now to our programming in countering violent extremism. Last year, the Asia Foundation took stock in its work on conflict and violence, looking at over the last 2 decades. Since 1995, the Asia Foundation has implemented 212 projects throughout the Asia-Pacific region, valued at approximately $390 million. In all 18 countries where we work, the Foundation has worked on a diverse range of conflict and violence issues, from conflicts over natural resources to subnational conflicts to urban crime and violence. And funding has come through various sources. The U.S. Department of State, Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Britain's Overseas Development arm DFID, DANITA, the Danish Overseas Development Agency, the World Bank, among other funders. And given our experience in working on the array of projects, our work has been guided by 3 core principles. A is a commitment to do no harm and to show sensitivity to conflict. B, to articulate, test, and revisit underlying assumptions using theories of change. And C, to apply robust monitoring and evaluation to assess results and refine approaches. We do this using 3 major approaches. One is we call leaders of influence work, which engages religious leaders along with women, youth, and secular leaders to deliver messages to their communities to counter fundamentalism, violence, gender bias, and corruption, all of which can raise the risk of violent extremism. Our Islam and civil society work with Muslim leaders whose religious authority can advance peace and development. In Indonesia, the Foundation has supported Islamic civil society to help citizens understand their rights. We've also done this in other places like Bangladesh and Afghanistan, which lie out of the topic of this talk today. And the third approach is safe spaces for dialogue, where the Foundation enables individuals from different communities, especially youth, and those living in polarized environments to come together for joint activities and dialogue. To use as an example, in Malaysia, the Asia Foundation empowers girls and other vulnerable youth through basic and alternative education programs, including dance, theater, and community journalism. Given the brief time I have left, I'd just like to highlight a handful of things we've done recently in Southeast Asia, and I'll conclude my remarks. Regionally, the Foundation has supported a violent incident monitoring system known as VIMS, with current programs in Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Nepal, the Philippines, and Thailand. In Myanmar, grants were made to support the work of two local partners, the Myanmar Institute for Peace and Security and the Center for Diversity and National Harmony, both of which are monitoring the current situation in Rakhine State. In Thailand, our partner Deep South Watch continues to monitor violence in southern border provinces. And in September 2017, a regional workshop was held in Bangkok for all country partners with a focus on gender-based violence and data visualization, but also the use of social media and how it can help perpetuate violence and extremism. Trying to work to educate people, especially youth, to reduce hate speech, fake news, and disinformation through the use of technology. The Foundation conducted something called Tech Camp Thailand, promoting peace and dialogue for technology for 60 youth leaders from Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. The program brought together social activists and technology experts to share practical and effective technology tools to promote peace and tolerance. In Indonesia, we've worked with the Indonesian National Police to develop and disseminate an internal circular on addressing hate speech to advise police leadership on how to interpret and implement anti-hate speech regulations. And the Foundation has also trained 200 community leaders and local government officials on religious tolerance through the School for the Management of Diversity. In Malaysia, we work in the eastern state of Sabah, which has seen a rise in domestic and transnational crime in recent years, including an increase in violence and extremism. In 2017, the Foundation worked with community leaders to improve knowledge among border communities on basic human rights and the work of extremists. We've also worked with local enforcement agencies in Sabah. A project called the Engaging Youth and Community Leaders to Counter Violence and Extremism in the Border Regions of Sabah project has engaged 400 vulnerable youth through cultural and soccer camps and has trained approximately 125 community paralegals and 47 community police. Through these activities, the program is building resilience among youth leaders to counter violent extremism in border regions of Sabah. In Myanmar, this report, The Contested Areas of Myanmar, is a report that's a companion volume to an earlier report called The Contested Corners of Asia research. The report examines the three-way relationship between foreign aid, development processes, and conflict, and outlines how different forms of development assistance interact with conflict dynamics and help shape positively or negatively, purposely or inadvertently, the prospects for peace in Myanmar. In the interest of time, why don't I just stop there? There are other programs that I could mention. I'd be happy to talk with people, but if there are these reports, we have the state of conflict and violence in Asia, the one I just mentioned, the contested areas of Myanmar, and understanding violence in Southeast Asia, the VIMS project I mentioned earlier. You can go to our website at www.asiafoundation.org and poke around. You'll be able to download these reports if you're interested. So I hope I've been able to give a solid general sense of what the region is facing and some of the Foundation's programs and how we're trying to mitigate violent extremism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. So I'll turn over to Professor Vuković, who is a lecturer here at SAIS, an assistant professor, in courses including conflict resolution, negotiation, and mediation. He's going to focus his remarks on research they've conducted in Indonesia and also mention a little bit about some of the gender dynamics affecting violent extremism in Indonesia.
Thank you. Indeed, my experience with Indonesia is very fresh. Various SICE programs take their students abroad for a study trip, and I was fortunate enough to go to Indonesia twice in 2017 for study purposes. And the initial intention to go to Indonesia was to explore the dynamics of potential reconciliation in Indonesia. For those of you who are even remotely familiar with Indonesian history may know about the events of 1965 and 1966, which are quite widely discussed in Western media, but when you go to Indonesia, you see that you are hitting the wall. And what we realized during our study was that while the issue of reconciliation was not such a hot topic or researchable topic, we realized that there is a very fertile ground to study and learn from the Indonesian experience about CVE and PVE practices. So what I'm going to talk about today are the main insights from this research, and I will leave some space for Q&A that will follow up later so that I don't hijack everything in my own talk. Now, as we have just heard, and I would like to just emphasize this, the global CVE agenda is anecdotally scarce with insights coming from Southeast Asia. We are aware of the importance of countries such as Indonesia, but it is only through some of the very recent and cutting-edge research that we are starting to learn about tailor-made approaches to CVE and its programming initiatives. Now, as we all know, the CVE practices are contingent upon political and security sectors' circumstances. Thus, lessons from Indonesia and other East Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries in particular, may provide us with clues how to go about with future planning and strategizing. As we have just heard, violent extremism is not new to Indonesia. So in order to understand better how Indonesia is coping with this issue, let's start with the very basic facts. I think that they're all very well known to you, but I think that they are very useful just to remind oneself about. First of all, Indonesia is the fourth largest country when it comes to the population in the world. And as we have just heard, it is the largest, it is a country with the largest Muslim population in the world at the same time. We're talking about 260 million in total. What is also very important about Indonesia, especially when you go to Indonesia, they make sure to remind you of it, is that it's the largest island country in the world, and thus it's very difficult to manage it compared to more geographically concentrated countries. The number of islands actually varies, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this. It varies between 13,000 and 17,000. It all depends on the tides. So 4,000 islands get lost as the moon moves in and out of the viewpoint. More than half of Indonesia's population lives on the Java island. So you can understand that there is also a demographic congestion on very specific locations, which also imposes significant security concerns for the local and central governments. And the country in itself is also very diverse. It has more than 700 local languages. So Bahasa is kind of the lingua franca that was taught as of recently, and it's acquired as a symbol of national identity. There is no dominant ethnic group, and what brings them together is the so-called 5 principles of Pancasila. And the Pancasila principles have been enshrined since the beginning of the country in 1945 by then President Sukarno. Now, we have heard that for the Western audience, Indonesia came into spotlight in 2012. But what really happened in Indonesia when it comes to CVE practices started already in 2002 with the first Bali bombings, the so-called Bali bombings, where the government was trying to find ways to engage with then labeled as terrorist actors in order to develop some form of trustworthy cooperative relationships. We were talking about initial approaches were approaches to engage in prisons. So engage with those ones that have been apprehended, sentenced, and imprisoned, and to find some ways of cooperating with them within that context. Since then, the range of initiatives has expanded dramatically and now include more proactive approaches, such as education campaigns that promote the ideals of peace among youth and that abate the appeal of extremist narratives, management of prisoners, as I just mentioned, reintegration and resocialization policies of former terrorists. Now, what is very important to understand about Indonesia, and Indonesia can serve as a litmus test to many other countries, not only in Southeast Asia, but around the world, is that there is a significant detachment between bottom-up and top-down approaches. So government-led approaches compared to those from civil society organizations. Now, in 2009, there was another series of attacks, the Jakarta hotel bombings, and a series of threats to then-president, which colloquially is referred to in the West as SBY, the National Counterterrorism Agency was established, and this was in 2010. It was mandated to coordinate different agencies and stakeholders in Indonesia that are coping with the domestic terrorist threat. However, managing all of these competing institutions in Indonesia is not an easy task. The limits of the government-led initiatives have often been addressed by the civil society organizations. What is unique about civil society organizations in Indonesia, and they're very grassroots and very small, these are small shops, these are not very robust, is that they have a very valuable local experience, local knowledge, contacts, points of entry with different stakeholders on a very micro level, which the government should use, but it's not using its full potential. Now, instead of using it more proactively and more systematically, the government's agency, the BMPT, is only using it when needed. So basically, when they realize that their top-down policies are not addressing the issue sufficiently. In order to kind of find a better way to coordinate these activities with civil society organizations, the government has established forums. Now, forums have become, the most famous forum is the Forum Koordinasi Pencegahan Terorisme, which is the acronym is FKPT, which is supposed to create the architecture for these regional forums. However, many observers have noted that this is just a forum. It's a talk shop for terrorism. And there are various limits to these types of engagements. Now, on the public, on a kind of a campaign level, it looks maybe good, but these include local government officials, academics, former police officers, and clerics from the Indonesia Ulama Council. However, the criticism is often very high level, largely involving regional elites in discussions intended to raise awareness of violent extremism, rather than reaching people who may be prone to radicalization, especially youth. So there is a detachment between supply and demand. Who is really supposed to be involved in these discussions, who is supposed to be the recipient of the messages of these discussions, and the actual effects of these discussions. This detachment between bottom-up and top-down has been anecdotal, to say the least, as I just mentioned. And one thing that really sticks out is recent findings that show us why youth have been de-radicalized. What were the reasons for their de-radicalization tendencies? And I'm going to give you the top 4. So recent findings, direct interviews with more than 50, I think, former jihadis who have been open enough to say why they abandoned the cause. They listed top 4 reasons. First one was the disillusionment with leadership. The second one was an awareness that cost of action, of what you are doing, outweigh personal or movement-wide benefits. So there was already kind of what's the added value of conducting these terrorist activities. Then developing new friendships away from the militant groups that they were part of. And the fourth one is changes to personal ambitions such as furthering education, having children, and providing for a family. So you can understand, if these are the reasons for de-radicalization, many of the top-down approaches do not address any of them. And this detachment then provides adverse effects. We are seeing, and we have seen that in our study while in Indonesia, that many of the policies of, let's say, counter-narratives, providing alternative ways of communication, did not really address the micro level, the actor that is on the ground being radicalized, and the reasons why they're being radicalized. And let me just finish with one thing, and I think I'm giving a segue to my colleague that is coming after me. One of the most illuminating things that came out of this study was when we were just confronted with a very simple question. What would you say, especially in the West, what would we say if we heard that there is a young man who is very introvert, does not socialize very much, dresses in modest clothes, reads a lot of religious texts, does not listen to pop music, only listens to radios where there are ulamas who are talking, does not engage with his peers in everyday activities, but rather visits religious sites and talks about religious issues all the time? What would you say? That chances are that this young man is very prone to extremist views, that he has a tendency to be radicalized. However, in Indonesia, this is a virtue. This is a pious young man. And the problem about many of the CVE policies in Indonesia, and I think in most of the Southeast Asia, is that this meso level in which we're trying, which try to address institutions on the societal institutions, so not really high-level governmental institutions, but societal institutions to address the issues of radicalization, oftentimes appear punitive just because of religious views. And there is this level of grudge feeling between recipients of those messages and the intentions that these policies are trying to create. So I will stop there, and I hope that I did not hijack any of, because I know you're going to talk about Indonesia, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I'll turn it over to Luke for our final kind of presentation before we turn to questions and answers. Luke is a senior governance specialist at the International Republican Institute, focused on countering violent extremism. He previously worked with their Asia division. I know he's recently back from Mindanao and has some insights to share comparing the Philippines and Indonesia.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. And thank you to that excellent segue from my esteemed panelist. I'm actually really pleased that he approached it from the sort of the de-radicalization side, the post-radicalization side, mainly because I'm going to be focusing much more on the preconditions for radicalization, and hopefully we'll kind of construct together a much more comprehensive understanding of who it is that's actually participating in this violent extremism activity and joining up with violent extremist organizations. But first, very quick overview of International Republican Institute, the IRI, where I work currently. We do programming related to improved governance, democratic governance, political party work, election monitoring, and quite a bit of survey research, both qualitative and quantitative, some of which I'll talk about here today. And we do this in over 60 countries around the world. That varies quite a bit, as you may imagine. But with regards to our CVE and our PVE work that we do, we definitely approach this from a thematic perspective at IRI, but also recognize that it is an extremely localized problem. It's a very fluid problem, and one that necessitates a better understanding of local dynamics before we can actually do any sort of develop any sort of responsive programming to it. For my talk today, I want to focus much more from the perspective of an implementer and talk about three broad preconditions for violent extremism, particularly with a particular focus on Indonesia and the Philippines, both countries of which we have active programming. Violent extremism in the region in particular is growing and is diffusing such that the flow of fighters, resources, and ideology and weapons is happening at a higher pace, particularly between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, some of which the panelists have already spoken about today. This has added a complex dynamic to the problem of violent extremism in Southeast Asia, but is predicated on three broad principles or preconditions. The specific ones that I'd like to highlight today, the first being the presence of ungoverned or insufficiently governed space. The second is the globalization of jihad. And the third is the presence of domestic violent extremist organizations. So each of these three factors is inextricably linked. In fact, they feed off of each other and create a much more insidious problem in the region. With the presence of ungoverned or insufficiently governed space, it's important to note that violent extremism does manifest in a number of various ways and does adapt to existing local conditions. Yet the commonality of ungoverned space as a precondition is something that, at least from the International Republican Institute's perspective and research from other organizations like those represented here on the panel today, do point out that that insufficient governance does oftentimes become exploited by violent extremist organizations who insert themselves in existing conflict and existing social cleavages and exacerbates an existing problem and provides an outlet for expressing grievances from a population oftentimes who would otherwise never consider joining up with a radical organization. Violent extremist organizations have become very skilled exploiters of this ungoverned space. In Indonesia in particular, despite the country's very impressive democratic progress, there has been recently in particular a rise of this us-them dynamic that has contributed to the perspective of many individuals, particularly on the island of Java, but elsewhere throughout the archipelago, of seeing themselves as sort of being disenfranchised from the leadership who they feel have become one of blasphemy and hypocrisy. This can be most obviously seen recently with the Ahok trials, for those of you who follow Indonesian politics, where the purported blasphemy from the mayor of Jakarta, the governor of Jakarta, Mr. Ahok, was seen as sort of the latest manifestation of an overly secularized government. Now, it's important to note that while there is growing dissatisfaction with that current dynamic in Indonesia, it's being co-opted by groups who are more bent on violence, who don't even necessarily espouse the viewpoint of a lot of average Indonesians who are dissatisfied with the Indonesian government, but are in fact infiltrating that existing social cleavage and using it for recruitment purposes. In Mindanao, in particular in the Philippines, the southern island of Mindanao, there's a protracted conflict that's been going on there for centuries that is also stemming from this perception of insufficient governance and sort of distancing from a growing gulf, I should say, between the average citizens there and the government itself. There's this perception of exclusion from the governmental process, and a competing identity with so-called Imperial Manila, and the legacy of clan-based fighting that has spiked recently, most dramatically with the Marawi siege, but elsewhere particularly in the western portion of the island itself. And while there are certain efforts underway to address particular grievances of insufficient governance and political marginalization, such as the Bangsamoro Basic Law, and to the less cynical observer, the federalism process, it is clear that many of the fighting that is going on in Mindanao is due largely to political exclusion. And further, I'll emphasize this a number of times throughout this talk. ISIS has taken to identifying and exploiting these societal cleavages. In both Indonesia and the Philippines, ISIS has supported groups who are present in or positioned to exacerbate decades, and often, in the case of the Philippines, centuries-old conflict that I'll get into a little bit more later. The second precondition I want to focus on, the globalization of jihad. As ISIS's territory in the Middle East has been degraded, they've adapted to a much more disparate model of that's linked much more to ideology, that is linked by ideology and intent. This new model, however, poses particularly unique risks to parts of the world, such as Southeast Asia. ISIS has been identifying and supporting domestic groups and exploiting these ongoing conflicts, political and otherwise. In Indonesia, local affiliates have been receiving logistical and material support to carry out attacks against targets in Jakarta and elsewhere. In the last couple of years in particular, the shooting in Jakarta, the bus bombings last year point to a better financed and more ideologically guided group of domestic violent extremist organizations or affiliates in the country. And in the Philippines, ISIS support for the fighters in Mindanao, again, most recently in Marawi, showed that the transnational terrorist networks' adeptness at identifying and infiltrating these long-standing conflicts with pre-existing groups, which leads me to my final precondition, which is the presence of domestic violent extremist organizations as an essential prerequisite for growing radicalization and recruitment for violent extremist organizations. Global jihadist groups such as ISIS are able to gain a stronger foothold in contexts where domestic violent extremist organizations already exist, where widespread grievances already exist, and where power is concentrated, particularly political power is concentrated. However, the presence of existing domestic VEOs serves as a series of entry points into a lot of these local contexts where groups like ISIS would like to spread. ISIS has latched on to a lot of local terrorist groups and supplied them with resources to commit greater acts of violence and create a disproportionately big footprint. This amplifying effect has emboldened local groups and made existing local security challenges even greater. In Indonesia, terrorism conducted by local terrorist organizations is not a new phenomenon, as has been mentioned by both panelists. The Bali bombings in 2002 and the hotel bombings in 2009 in Jakarta have obviously shown that there is the presence of these local domestic groups. However, there is a direct sort of coinciding of the scale of attacks in Indonesia with the presence of larger, more aggressive in terms of expansion, transnational terrorist networks. In the early 2000s, it was more affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and more recently, it has been associated and linked to ISIS and their rise. In the Philippines, again, the centuries-old conflict in Mindanao has developed a cadre of fighters and fighting groups, particularly in the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, which has developed a number of fighting groups who are battle tested, who have their own specific grievances, their own specific targets, specifically against Imperial Manila and the rest of non-Muslim Philippines. However, this conflict, and this was really highlighted, I think, when my colleague and I were in Mindanao last week, and we were speaking with a lot of these groups and those doing research with these groups, and the conflict itself there has sort of resulted in a bifurcated recruitment pool. The older, it's broken down primarily on a generational divide. The older fighters of MILF who are participating in the protracted peace process in Mindanao have frustrated and served as an entry point and a recruitment call for a lot of the younger, more recent violent extremist groups such as Abu Sayyaf Group and Maute, both of whom were very active in the Marawi siege. These younger fighters and these younger Filipinos are frustrated with the older generation's lack of action, lack of response to what they're perceiving as this political and social marginalization, and are willing to take up arms with groups who are willing to actually take action, such as Maute and ASG. So once again, ISIS has seen this as a potential foothold and has subsequently provided material support, inspiration, and logistical guidance. From the perspective of IRI, we have active PVE, CVE programming in a number of countries around the world, Southeast Asia being one of them. From our institutional perspective, we have a three-phased approach to addressing violent extremism: understand, inform, and equip. That first phase of our programming really builds on our decades of survey research experience, where we have set up a series of mixed methods qualitative research projects to really understand local dynamics, local drivers of violent extremism, so that we can adapt programming and develop programming to our other phases of research. We've conducted this assessment in West and Central Java, Solo in particular, in Central Java, and Bogor and Bandung in West Java, where we've looked at the intersection of violent extremism, intolerance in local politics, local elections this year. And a lot of what I've spoken about today has come from research that we've conducted, specifically focusing on the preconditions being established for intolerance and radicalization stemming from the perceived grievance of governance gaps and social and governance exclusion. We have some reports coming out on this in the very near future, so please do stay tuned for those. And I will end there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much to our entire panel for some really insightful remarks. We have about 40 minutes left for question and answer, which is fantastic. It's always one of the most interesting parts of the session. I'm going to try and group questions so we can get to as many as possible. I'm going to abuse the privilege of the moderator to ask the first question, which is around the role of the international community and the West in influencing violent extremism in Southeast Asia. Search for Common Ground has worked on CVE in about 15 countries, including Indonesia and elsewhere. And one of the things, we've seen, of course, is that the international community is heavily involved in fact, shapes a lot of these dynamics on the ground. One of the things that we've been keeping an eye on, for example, is the rise of political Islam and the concerns about that being linked conceptually by external actors as part of violent extremism, being a risk rather than a clear recognition of the nuances between those different groups. I wonder if each of you might be able to say a little bit about kind of how international actors are influencing this region and maybe where they have resonance, where they don't. Sure, whoever.
Please. Same order.
Sure,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think the one thing that's important to bear in mind, and I believe the foundation, takes this very much to heart, that we work with a set of partners through in whatever country we're working in as it relates to countering violent extremism. I don't think we go in with a cookie-cutter approach that one size fits all, and and to be able to work with individuals, with leaders who have and groups that have credibility in the region or in a particular country or area that's being contested in a country, and so there's some places where you perhaps can be a bit more pronounced, but I think our general take is that we let we let our partners in the countries where we're in be able to take the lead, perhaps provide guidance, but not to take be out in front. That's a mistake.
If I may just follow up on that, from the research that I was part of, we realized that there is a growing gap in awareness of the nuances of, let's say, in this case, Indonesian reality compared to the template, the expectations of what CVE should achieve. And the approach to empowering local stakeholders, local actors to have more say, to have a stronger voice in strategizing, creating these tailor-made policies is certainly more welcome than anything else. However, what we found was that many of the let's say benchmarks or thresholds from the conventional CVE toolkit does not really fit the realities that, let's say, Indonesia is confronted by. say the counter-narrative approach. If you know, on paper it sounds very, very compelling. It sounds very attractive to find an alternative message for the disenfranchised, disgruntled, marginalized youth, to tell them that there is another way, to tell them that what they have been told is a wrong kind of abused message, both about the religion and about their social roles. But what we have also realized, especially in Indonesia, is that these messages really do not achieve its full potential on the one hand, or meet the expectations. Those individuals will not hear that message. And the reason why they were radicalized was not because of the message itself, but because, as we have just heard, was because specifically of their social predicament that they were in. And this predicament is very individual. It is case-to-case basis. And finding this mega narrative, kind of the macro narrative that is going to be, again, one size fits all. One ulama is just going to go outside and say all the good things, and all of the youth are just going to follow his lead and say, well, we're no longer going to view this in a radical way. I think it's wishful thinking. And Indonesian case shows it, because if you look at Indonesia, the size of the country, the geographical kind of composition of the country, the number of extremists, or those ones that actually took on extremist action, is marginal. It's a statistical error. But then on the other hand, the messages, the narrative, et cetera, while, as I said, may be viewed as pious, may be viewed as religiously acceptable locally in Indonesia, in the West is viewed as potentially problematic. It raises flags. So there is, as I said, a growing gap of what is being addressed and what the real trigger mechanisms for those individuals are. And I think that this is exactly how the international community oftentimes misses the point of what is really effective and what do they try to achieve as one of the checkpoints or check marks that they're trying to check away. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I would just, to be a little repetitive, intentionally repetitive, of the importance of it being locally and data-driven, any sort of response into these contexts. And what we have found from a lot of our research is very much some of the points that have been made, that the international development organization footprint needs to be small as possible. I mean, the focus really should be on understanding capacity of local groups and addressing any sort of gaps there, specifically relative to the local context. But I would further nuance that and say that a lot of the there's an important distinction that oftentimes is not made between CVE specific work and CVE relevant work. I think as an international implementer, IRI is very intentional about distinguishing between those two. The former, the CVE specific work, being programming. Oftentimes it looks very similar to non-CVE work, being called CVE specific work based on addressing a specific threat and working with a specific audience. Again, a lot of times it will look very similar to work that we do to just improve governance in a number of contexts, or to ensure that political parties are actually addressing the needs of their constituents, or whatever it is to help improve the political and governance mechanisms within a country. However, and the reason we start institutionally with research and understanding local drivers and local dynamics is to ensure that we are identifying the specific threat, and we are identifying the specific audience susceptible to violent extremism, as well as those who are resilient to it, that can serve as partners. And then from there, we really focus heavily on equipping them with the resources and technical expertise that they need and want and request. And so, again, if it's driven by the data, if it's driven by our research, then we feel we're addressing an actual problem in an actual way.
Thank you. Great, so we'll turn it over to the audience for question and answers. My colleague Venus will be passing the mic. Please wait for the mic and introduce yourself when you ask your question. So we can start here. I see 1, 2, and then I saw 3. So maybe we can start with those 3 right here with Anne.
Thank you very much. Ann Phillips, USIP. I have 2 questions, if I might. What role have security forces played in exacerbating or mitigating the dynamic toward violent extremism? And second, specific to the Philippines and Mindanao, what's the status of the federalism program there that has been talked about for some time? When you talked about Mindanao, I was interested that you linked this with ungoverned spaces because the movements there have traditionally pushed for, if not independence, greater autonomy. So I'd be interested in the information about the federalism program and how that might meet some of these long-standing grievances. Thank you.
We're going to group the questions just to make sure we get to as many of them as we can.
Thank you. My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. Basically, I would like to know is what's the complaint Muslim or those people you think causing the violence or terrorism. Could you say in terms of the data, what you get for your research, and in terms of the historical comparison or geographical comparison, whether in the Southeast Asia or in the United States or in a global wide? I think the terror is really happening everywhere in England, in Italy, maybe in France, in the United States. Just what causes whether the Muslim they are complain and you did not resolve it. Just mandatory resolution is not going to help because corruption is everywhere. Maybe America, USA cause more problem than Muslims themselves. So you don't solve the Muslim their complaint. Rather, you are talking about everywhere. They just causing the violence.
Thank you. And then just over here.
Hi, my name is Allison Bartel. I'm with Internews. Thank you so much for your presentation. I had a question about the detachment between top-down and bottom-up approaches that you brought up for Indonesia. And I was wondering if you see this reflected across the region, or if there are variances between countries, if you could point out some of those and sort of the dynamics between civil society organizations and government initiatives. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'll ask our panelists to answer concisely if possible, because I saw a lot of hands here. But please.
Should we go in the same order?
Sure.
Okay. Let me answer in terms of, I guess, your question about the role security forces have played in exacerbating or mitigating violent extremism. Let me use the example of Myanmar right now. I had mentioned before about the Rohingya in Rakhine State. There is the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. It seems to be a under-resourced organization that has had some impact in terms of wreaking havoc in Rakhine State with the military. But at the same time, nothing like what happened in Marawi. I think given the heavy-handedness of the Burmese armed forces, the Tatmadaw, I think that's an example of where the situation has become exacerbated by the armed forces. And so I don't view that as a recipe for success. And what we see is that people, can be grouped in with these, with this small whether it's viewed as a terrorist group or whether it's viewed as a group that's fighting for its ethno-nationalist, identity. I think that the military, Burmese military, has only exacerbated it. In terms of the Muslims being, I'm trying to read my writing now, compliant about violence and terrorism, I'm trying to remember, what was your question? Historically, how do you resolve their complaint? And I wanted to use as an example Thailand, which is something that has been going on for a very long time. I think you can go back as far as 1910 with this problem, though most people think of it as something being more since 2004. I lived in Thailand, in southern Thailand, for 1 year in 1980, 81, not too far away from the three southernmost provinces. And at that time, there was also a vibrant separatist group called the Patani United Liberation Organization. And, you know, as I mentioned in my comments, I think that this is a long festering insurgency that isn't really so much about religion as it is opposed to ethnic identity, though it happens to include religion in it. I think the challenge has been how to make those who are in the southernmost provinces, 80% of them being ethnic Malays, mostly Muslim, how to make them feel as part of the Thai nation state when everything is so different from them. Their religion is different, their ethnicity is different. They don't relate as greatly. So I think in some ways being able to just enable them to, you know, acknowledge that their differences with their schools, with their language, but economically though, how does that translate? There are a lot of people who are where the Thai language is their third language. The first language is Yawi, which is you know, indigenous to them. Their second language is something called Pakdai, which is a southern dialect. And then you get into Pasaglang, which is the central dialect. And so really this is learning as a, you know, as a third language. So I think it's something that I think the Thais, central authorities, and the citizens of the Deep South have been trying to grapple with. We have been trying to do that through various programs, but I think economic development also has to be part of the equation to help them feel that they have a greater stake in the Thai nation, or any nation.
Thank you. I'll try to address all three questions, but briefly. When it comes to the role of security forces, in the case of Indonesia, it is a very interesting time right now that if you are looking into some evidence of how security forces may exacerbate the situation. There's an ongoing competition between military and police on who is going to be tasked with counterterrorism activities and in CVE practices. And you know, in democracies, when it comes to domestic concerns and domestic security threats, it is the police that is supposed to address these issues. However, Indonesian military is trying to get as much of a control on the issue as possible. A little reflection on Indonesian history may tell you much about the reasons why the military wants to get that much control. From the events of 1965 and the Sukarno regime and the role that the military has played ever since, this becomes a very attractive issue to be confronted by, to be mandated with. So there is a very you know, vibrant competition between these two sectors, and this competition is not in who has more nuanced, more creative approaches to the threat that they are confronted by. No, it's who's going to be more repressive, who is going to be more aggressive, assertive, et cetera, et cetera. So you can understand that they are just complicating, adding more complexity to the issue. So as such, this competition then spills over to disenfranchisement, the securitization within the communities, or the sense of securitization within the communities, and as such creates, I would say for the time being, more of a correlation than causality. We do not know if it really directly causes more extremist points of view or activities, but we certainly know that it creates a fertile ground that may breed those types of activities. On the second issue, when it comes to historical grievances and what needs to be addressed, et cetera, I would approach it in a different way. First of all, it's all about the framing. What kind of frames, what kind of narratives one is confronted by or one is surrounded by. So if you look at really most of the studies about violent extremism, they come to a conclusion that, and I'm going to use a label from a study, all jihad is local. Meaning it's not a universal it's not a universal ideal. It is viewed as a universal ideal, but really who gets mobilized are specific people within very specific communities. So Luke mentioned in our preparation for the talk that he was in Kosovo. I come from the Balkans, so let's say many of the foreign fighters who come from the Balkans come from specific villages. So they don't come from across the country in an evenly distributed way. No, they come from very specific villages, very specific locations that have been confronted with this gap in public services, the absence of public goods, the failure of state to address their specific concerns. So I would say that it becomes a global movement due to frames, not due to specific grievances. Grievances get framed into a master narrative, and this master narrative then feeds into a more catch-all approaches that one's grievance in a specific village can be linked to a very similar grievance, but these are very peculiar, very particular across, let's say, nation, across the state. And then the final one, on the detachment top-down, bottom-up, I explained the Indonesian reality, but I assume that, let's say, in the Philippines, as we have seen, especially if you look at the central Manila approaches, present government, and the way they have been treating the MILF and MNLF, you will understand that local concerns in Mindanao have been completely marginalized compared to more global agenda that the government in Manila is conducting. And if I may, just to kind of link these two, the frames about the insurgency in Mindanao is a very unique example of how one thing is viewed as, let's say, a religious conflict. It's labeled through the religious lenses or ethnic lenses, etc. But if you go back really in time and see where the root causes of this conflict are and how populations have been assuming the saliency of ethno-nationalist identity, it's because of specific socioeconomic conditions that the populations were affected by. In Mindanao specifically, they were treated differently just because of their religion during the colonial times of the Spanish, in which the land ownership on the island of Mindanao that was collectively owned was no longer allowed, and it was privately distributed. So there was this, again, top-down, bottom-up diversity or detachment that then transformed itself into us versus them through the lenses of religion. And if you are now trying to address the land ownership issue from the past, which still exists today, that you may actually unpack the reasons why it has been labeled as a religious conflict, because it's more inclusive as a label than how much land do you own, how much someone else owns, et cetera, et cetera. This is, in order to mobilize, you need a more comprehensive message than, particularistic message on individual basis. So.
Yeah, just the one thing I'll add on that, the first question with regards to the role of security forces, exacerbating or mitigating the problem. My colleague spoke much more eloquently than I could about the negatives of security forces. with regards to violent extremism. But the one thing I would like to add is the important distinction between hard power and soft power approaches to preventing and countering violent extremism. The two often get conflated. CVE, I mean, there's obviously an immense amount of debate over a lot of these acronyms, but the difference between counterterrorism, counterinsurgency versus preventing violent extremism. Actually, in an earlier talk, there was a discussion about the BNPT and the FKPT in Indonesia, for example, who are very much in the realm of CVE and PVE. They focus much more on community engagement. I mean, at least their mandate is such that they focus on community engagement, ensuring that people have a forum, literally, to discuss some of their grievances. And whether or not it works is another discussion. But they do exist to focus more from that angle, whereas the police and military's mandate is much more to respond with force to existing threats, actual threats, security threats against the state. Now, the latter category, the security personnel, oftentimes is seen as a major grievance that is oftentimes metastasizes into joining up with violent extremist organizations. I mean, this is all over the world, too. I mean, outside of Southeast Asia. A lot of our research in Tunisia, places like Kenya, this is oftentimes identified as the reason why an individual would join up with a violent extremist organization. So there is a clear distinction between the mandates. Too often, security personnel, for a number of reasons, historical and otherwise, they take their mandate too far, perhaps, and that can serve as a mobilizing factor. With regards to federalism in the Philippines, the advocates for federalism, specifically under the guise that it will address a lot of the grievances, particularly in the ARM region, the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, make the claim that should power devolve, should it be a more proportional representative system, then those local populations will be better represented in Parliament, and therefore their grievances will be better addressed. Now, that case is being made by advocates of federalism. So, the overt advocates of federalism are not necessarily citizens within the ARM. So, again, it's sort of an academic question at this point. It's very abstract, and whether or not it actually would work out that way is obviously to be determined. But at least advocates for federalism are making the claim that by decentralizing and ensuring greater representation, which could be accomplished through federalism, theoretically a lot of these grievances would be addressed by virtue of them having a voice. And then the other questions were addressed very well, so I'll leave them.
And if I may, just on the security force issue, Search for Common Ground has worked with the counterterrorism police in Indonesia, with the prison system, with the parole system. We've worked quite a bit with security forces on this issue. And I think, while our colleagues absolutely correctly highlighted that for many individuals who participate in violent extremism, this is a driving factor and a grievance that they cite. At the same time, there's no solution to the problem of violent extremism that doesn't involve working with security actors in a constructive and collaborative way. So what we've seen is that there are positive actors within these institutions. There are champions. Sometimes they don't have the skill set or the training to engage constructively with community members. They don't know how to talk to a human rights organization in a way that is not adversarial. But in fact, the two are looking for the same thing, which is security. And so one of the things that we've really focused on is how do we build those constructive relationships and work with security actors to improve their practices, but also so that security isn't something that's envisioned only as something that security forces implement, that communities own security, that the security forces are in some way accountable to the communities where they work and vice versa, and that it's a holistic relationship and not one that's just the security forces are there, they're there to solve the problem, and everybody else is either part of the problem or you're not, but rather something that's a mutual ownership.
Sorry, just one last thing on that. It's worth noting, too, that security forces in Indonesia, even the very controversial Detachment 88, have stopped very big, large-scale terrorist attacks in Jakarta very recently. So obviously they are fulfilling an element of their mandate and are essential to the process.
So another round of questions. I see 1, 2, 3 right here. So maybe we'll do those 3. And then I see 1 here and 1 here, just in case we have extra time. But let's do these 3 right in a row first.
Thank you. Stacy Shamber from ICANN, the International Civil Society Action Network. I'm curious in all of your research and programming if you have any gender-specific observations, either in the preconditions for radicalization or reasons for de-radicalization, or just overall recommendations as we look at mitigating CVE.
You can just pass it right up.
Well, you kind of took my question, but my name's Angel Sharma. I'm from the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative. Following up on the previous question, I know Indonesia, I think sometime last year, captured the first female jihadist, and so I'd be curious to know if you think that that's a trend that we will be seeing in the region, or if that was, in your opinion, a one-off thing.
Malcolm O'Dell. I spent about 13 years in Nepal working all the way up through the grassroots application of peace-building initiatives. And an observation to oversimplify what the panel is saying. I think it goes back to, what Joe Biden said his father always told him. Don't talk to me about your values, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what your values are. And it's obvious that the budget goes to the security forces, the military. I think if we take all the combined efforts of the panelists and the groups they represent, and those in this audience that are working on these issues, and the Peace Corps and the U.S. Institute of Peace, put those budgets together, they don't show up as a cipher in the national budget compared to the military, and that's true worldwide. So I think we can probably agree that the military solution is only aggravating. It's hardly salving it. It's driving deeper divisions among people all the way around the world, right here in the United States. So the alternative is what we're talking about: is the peace-building approach, the prevention and resolution of violent extremism, isn't it? And it seems to me that we got some lessons that we've learned. Certainly, we learned them in Nepal. Bridge building and trust. We innocently started a process of appreciative inquiry in Nepal to do some development work in the mountains to try and improve relations between the local people and the natural environment. And in the process, we found that we had a tool that was really exciting people, and it went to work with the gender issue, with a women's empowerment program that the Asia Foundation was part of. They had a rights, responsibility, and advocacy program that was part of another program of the Women's Empowerment Project that reached 130,000 women who went right through the Maoist rebellion and came out the other side with active savings groups and increased income and no conflict in the family. They resolved domestic conflict, and they had been able to get along with the Maoists and everybody else. In the end, this network that we created ostensibly for community development became a peace-building initiative. There was a peace-building summit. Hundreds of people from all over the country were part of it. They went out using a simple tool, appreciative inquiry tool. We have 3 questions: what's working, what's even better look like, and how do we get there? And when it came to the huge protest marches that tried to end the Maoist rebellion and bring the Constitution back, there were hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets, and they were in conflict, and they were heading for the palace. And there was a shoot-to-kill curfew. And we contacted the police commissioner from the National Police Training Academy and said, is this all going to fall apart? I think Jimmy Carter wanted to come, but the American embassy said it was too dangerous. He said, not at all. He says, first of all, this is the land of Buddha. And secondly, we take to heart that summit, the principles of appreciative inquiry. Give us a little time and watch what happens. 100,000 people marched to the palace, and the police just melted away. And they brought about a peaceful solution to the war, to the conflict. The king eventually stepped down. because there was this kind of network of people all over the country. And I think this is what Search for Common Ground tries to do. This is what the Asia Foundation tries to do. This is what we're all trying to do. It seems to me if we pour our efforts into things like that, we're going to get some results. And I'd like comments because you've seen it on the ground. I don't know if you've seen it in Nepal, anybody, but it's a household word there.
Thank you.
Shall we take the fourth one as well? Because two were very compatible. The
Sure,
gender
yeah. Did you want to?
issue.
Go ahead.
Ken Meyercord. Mr. Waggoner mentioned that the extremist groups are better financed these days. Do we know where that financing is coming from? And a sort of related question, a lot of countries are concerned about fighters who went to Syria returning to their home countries. I don't know what the count is for Southeast Asian countries, but do we know whether these fighters' involvement was self-financed or whether they received help?
Great.
Both going and coming.
Maybe we'll answer in reverse order, just to shake it up a little bit.
Oh,
and then
sure.
I think we'll probably end up closing with that. We only have about 6 minutes left, so I'd ask folks to just keep it brief, and then we can close.
Okay.
A lot of challenges in a short time.
Yeah, that is. So for the gender-specific questions, in terms of IRI's research, we have not done a lot of gender-focused research on violent extremism in Southeast Asia. That being said, we have in places like Tunisia and even some in Kosovo, as was mentioned. And it's worth noting that the problem of radicalization amongst female populations in a lot of the countries where we're working is a significant problem that is not necessarily examined always in the same way as male radicalization by the countries and those setting up the legal frameworks in particular. When it comes to returnees, when it comes to those who are being arrested for acts of terrorism, the legal framework for men and women in a lot of countries is not necessarily the same. That's one interesting thing that has come up. It's also worth noting that a recent study done on migrant workers, Filipino and Indonesian migrant workers in Hong Kong, really identified that that a lot of the individuals being radicalized amongst that population were women. In fact, disproportionately so. And so the issue of female radicalization should not be overlooked. And it's certainly an area that we would like to do more research on. And so in the interest of time, I'll leave that one there. With regards to the military solution aggravating the problem and the need for peace building, we certainly would agree on the essentiality of peace building. And from IRI's perspective, our focus, as you mentioned, is heavily on the preventative side. And so improving societal dynamics, improving community dynamics, improving social cohesion, and other elements that we think will help serve as deterrents for individuals resorting to violence to express their grievances. Grievances will exist and do exist everywhere, as we all know, even here. And the question has to be asked of what do people do in response to those grievances? How do they feel connected to outlets that are nonviolent, that are ideally democratic, in our perspective, to address a lot of their grievances without resorting to violence? So, we would, and in terms of budget allocations for international development, obviously we are in favor of that. So I will leave that one there. With regards to the financing of violent extremist organizations and returnees and where they're receiving a lot of their funding, we haven't done a lot of in-depth research from IRI's perspective on that. We have done a lot of desk research on this, and there are a lot of reports that exist on the financing mechanisms. And a lot of it is coming from these transnational terrorist networks. Again, territory was degraded for ISIS, but they are a very wealthy transnational terrorist organization with goals that haven't really changed. And so the way they're spending their money, and the way they have been spending their money over the last several years, has been in sending fighters where they need to be sent. I think in the first presentation there was the talk of the Malay-based detachment that was based in Syria for a while. Those were brought, the financing for that travel and training was ISIS. And so with regards to where ISIS is getting their funding, that is a question that we have not explored in great detail. But in terms of the returnees, the only thing I'll say about that is a growing concern, and I think politicians and policymakers are really trying to crack that. It's challenging because everything from being able to actually charge people with going abroad to fight to tiering what different acts of terrorism look like in a legal context, to developing an actual punitive framework for engaging in terrorism is one that has not been, it varies widely by country and even local context. So that's certainly a high priority, I think, of a lot of countries that are dealing with this problem, particularly Indonesia right now.
On the gender-specific issue, I just have maybe a more of an abstract remark, but I think it tackles the substance of the issue. As many of you may already know, Indonesia, in large parts of Indonesia, matrilinear society is very present, or matrilinear system is very present. However, there is a challenge to that matrilinear system, which comes with patriarchal, especially institutions and structures that exist. So this tension between those two create conditions that are susceptible to some form of manipulation about the perceptions and about the gender-specific roles of individuals within a society. Most of the research about female fighters has come to a very universal conclusion that is the reason why they join is because it gives them a meaning, it gives them a political voice, and especially in very patriarchal societies, this is an outlet for women to obtain a purpose, to obtain a social role. And as counterintuitive as it may sound, this is the way they feel empowered. So on the one hand, we're trying to come up with policies that empower women more so that they do not get hijacked by the narratives of becoming jihadi spouses, et cetera, but then on the other hand, we don't understand that this is the way they feel empowered. And addressing that, I know it's still hovering around a very macro level understanding, but it is pointing out to a micro level trend, and that is the gender mainstreaming policies within societies, and especially, so let's say my specific field is conflict management. So I looked at all of the peace agreements related to Indonesia. Not a single provision of peace agreements in Indonesia, so in Aceh, Maluku, Papua, there was not a single issue that was gender specific, that was addressing the role of women. That's point one. Point two, not a single woman was participating in the peace talks. So when it comes to understanding the political relevance of women, kind of self-awareness, I don't know if this is going to be blasphemy in this forum, but, from a Marxist point of view, becoming self-aware of one's own societal role is very important. And this is exactly what gives them a self-awareness that they contribute to something compared to not being attached to any meaningful life experience. So kind of linking the two. And I will stop at that just to not take much
All right, and
time.
we'll leave it to John to close it up.
Yeah, just a quick minute. I know the foundation has had projects that have included gender-based violence in conflict-ridden areas. But I can't speak with specificity about it at the moment, and so if we could talk afterwards, I'm happy to get information to you related to that, so we can exchange contact information. Secondly, as whether women jihadists, is this a trend? I mean, there have been things that have been anecdotal over the last year or two, and the anecdotes don't necessarily constitute data, and so I think that's very hard to figure. But I think nonetheless it is seems to be a trend. But how pronounced it will be is really unclear. I take the gentleman's point about a military solution, and especially when you get militaries and law enforcement not cooperating but competing, together, and who can play the bigger heavy. That's not a recipe for success. And then finally, on where do these people get their money? as Luke said, from ISIS, but where is ISIS getting its money from? That's, that's another matter, but they seem to be well-funded enough that since they lost all that territory in Iraq and Syria, that they've now sort of like they're franchising out, right, and going to different parts of the world, including the southern Philippines. And so people who went to, from Southeast Asia, who go back to the region, I would imagine that there are some, as I said, 45% of those people were women and children. There might be some when they get back, and the wives might be saying, what kind of life are you bringing us into here? Why are you doing this? Why don't we, do something else that's more constructive, with your life, and so we don't have to live in such danger. Others might be feeling more empowered, saying, well, we lost the battle, but we're not going to lose the war. So I imagine how people feel, what their own personal experience is going to determine on what avenue they may wish to choose post ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So with it, I'll leave it at that, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much to our panel for your fascinating presentations and also your comments. Thanks to our audience for great and difficult questions. Thanks for coming today. For those of you who are interested in future Conflict Resolution Prevention Forum events, we do have a website online where you can find upcoming events. The next event is in March, and it's focused on the Central African Republic, so we hope to see some of you there.